Welcome back to Gentleman and Scholar. I'm your host, Joshua Houston, joined today by a man who's very special to me. My father, John Houston, is with us today. He is a preacher of sorts. He goes around to different congregations in the area and preaches for them as they have need, but his full-time job is working for Tennessee Farmers Cooperative, and he's done that. How long have you done that?
It's been almost 33 years, Joshua.
So 33 years he's been going around and making a living by selling animal supplies, feed, animal health, things like that. And when you think about that, it doesn't really scream working with people, but that's your job. I mean, that's something that we have in common with our jobs, is we literally make our living working with people.
That's absolutely right. It's a people business. Whether you're in selling feed or whether you're preaching the gospel, it's a people business.
Well, I think everything in life, it can boil down to being a people business. You know, without people, without contacts, we wouldn't have anything. So what we want to talk about today is something that's not really easy for anybody to talk about, especially someone who might be a prideful person, which we're all guilty of at times. But that is the topic of how you know when you're wrong and what to do once you find out you're wrong about something. We're going to come at this from a couple of different angles. The first is to talk about what you do when you find out you're wrong spiritually, when you find out that you're wrong about your understanding of God, of Jesus, of salvation, things like that. And I know that you have a lot of background in this because you today are not where you were, 30 years ago or 40 years ago or whatever, and how you were raised. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about how you were raised, where you were raised, what life was like for you when you were growing up.
Well, Joshua, first of all, it's good to be with you on this podcast, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk about that. I was raised in a little area in East Tennessee. Grew up fairly rural where I was raised, and really was taught growing up that going to church was important. I was taught by my grandmother, the lessons of the Bible. Certainly was taught that every Sunday we would go to church, and my dad did not go to church. We went with my great grandfather. He would pull in to the driveway in his '65 Chevy pickup, and my mother and my grandmother and 3 boys would pile into the cab of that truck and go out about a mile to the little country church where we attended. I grew up in a denomination. I grew up being taught things that you're taught in certain denominations, and that's what I grew up knowing. And later on in life, I began to really dig into the Bible and learn some of the things that the truths of the Bible that either were not taught or that were taught incorrectly.
One thing I remember for us growing up, going to Spring City and being around Grandma and all those people, was the church building that you grew up going to. That was kind of unique. Why don't you speak a little bit to that?
The building where we worshipped at the time was a Union church, which was actually Baptist one Sunday and Methodist the next Sunday. And certainly everyone went every Sunday, as I recall, but there was a Baptist preacher there one Sunday, the next Sunday the Methodist preacher would be there.
When you were growing up, did you have any knowledge of the Lord's Church? Let's say, just for now, just use the title, the Church of Christ. Did you have any knowledge of that? And if you did, what'd you think of it?
Growing up, I had never heard of the Church of Christ, although there was a building in our town that had the Church of Christ on its sign. I had never paid any attention to that sign. I'd never paid any attention to that. I had never heard of the Church of Christ or anything about that until many years later, after being married, and we can get into that later, of moving to Spring Hill, Tennessee, and some of the things that evolved. But really, I had all of my ties in the local church and was very active there.
So you grew up in Spring City. You went to church. You were taught going to church was important. You knew the stories of the Bible. You believed and all that. Did that stay with you? Did that keep with you when you left home and went to college?
Well, I guess in a way it did, but obviously when I left home and went to college, I did things that I'm not proud of. I certainly was involved in things that I shouldn't have been. But however, I did always believe that there was a God, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. Certainly always believed those things, and certainly was always involved. Even in college, we would go to a denominational church as well, but there again, not understanding really what being a Christian was all about.
Now, when you got married, moved to Spring Hill, life started taking off, and it's about at that point that you and Mom started thinking more critically about the Bible and about those things of the Bible. So what was the transition point? What was the pivot point for y'all?
Well, here's the I guess the way things transpired. Your mother and I obviously were married. We were living in Jonesboro, Tennessee, and your mother had gotten her master's degree, and all of a sudden she ends up with a job in Spring Hill, Tennessee. Very uniquely, the principal there was an elder in the Lord's church, and so we moved to Spring Hill. She began to look into the Bible and the things that her principal and other people were saying. Also, your uncle was a member of the church and continued to talk with us as well. And then for some reason we bought a house in Spring Hill. And when we bought our first home in Spring Hill, we ended up buying a house. And our next door neighbor at the time was a deacon at the Spring Hill Church of Christ. The gentleman across the road was a deacon at the Spring Hill Church of Christ. Her principal, which was an elder, was at the end of the road, and another elder was two houses up. So they began to talk to us, and we began to really, really, really study the Bible. Not just hear the stories, not just listen to the stories, but to actually dive in to the Word. And some of the questions I had begun to ask myself, where is the Baptist church in the Bible? Where is the Methodist church in the Bible? Where are all these denominations? Where did they come from? And I kept looking to the conversation Jesus had with Peter. That's where he told Peter, he gave Peter the keys to the kingdom. And I just kept coming back to that and coming back to that. And then all of a sudden I saw, recorded in Acts chapter 2, on that day of Pentecost when Peter was preaching, everyone understood what Peter was saying, and he unlocked the kingdom at that time. And so from there, your mother and I were both baptized into Christ. A preacher by the name of Glenn Alexander at the Spring Hill Church studied with us and baptized us into Christ. As a matter of fact, you witnessed that baptism. I'm sure you don't remember it because you were about 6 months old, but you witnessed that baptism. And we, I hope and I'm glad to say, have not looked back since.
Now, when it comes to this transition that we're talking about, this pivot point, I think this is the difficult part for most people as they are coming to a faith and as they're trying to study for themselves, regardless of whether they're coming out of a denomination or whether they just have never heard of Jesus before. There's a point in which things shift, in which things change. So when you're studying with someone like Glenn, or with Mom, or with somebody else who calls you to think, when you looked at the Scripture and you realized you were wrong, and I mean, we do that today in the church. I mean, there are some things that we in the church today have looked at and said, we were wrong about this, and we need to change our thinking about, and that's going to continue to happen. I hope for the good and not for the bad of anything. But what was it that you looked at, and do you remember the moment? Do you remember that moment where you were like, I was wrong?
That's for sure. First of all, I need to make it clear that everything I was taught about the Bible growing up was not wrong.
Right.
So I certainly, all of those things were, everything was not incorrect. But I remember talking to your uncle, and also in particular with Brother Glenn about this baptism issue, and that's where I would always argue, and I would always really get upset at times about the baptism issue, that being that one must be baptized to be saved. And I certainly am convinced of that. And I remember Brother Glenn talking to me about that. And the one thing he said to me was, how does one have newness of life, as Paul records in Romans chapter 6? How does one have newness of life if he isn't born again, if he isn't baptized? Because certainly that newness of life is explained in Romans chapter 6, coming after one is baptized. And so then I began to study with him, and I saw these stories about the Ethiopian eunuch. I saw the stories about others, the Philippian jailer, and different ones, and every one that was converted were baptized. It was an immediate thing. Everyone did it in the same way, and they did it exactly like Peter said do it in Acts chapter 2. And so it all hit me at one time. You know what? There is no way that one can have remission of sins without baptism. If you're not willing to die spiritually with Jesus and be buried to meet his blood and to be raised, then how can one walk in newness of life? And that's when it hit me. And so that afternoon right then, your mother and I went to the Spring Hill Church and were baptized into Christ. And both of us had been baptized in the denominational world. As children, I was baptized in Watts Bar Lake at the age of 9. But then Glenn shared with me passages, in Acts, and we could go into those specific passages. But one in particular where folks were baptized for the wrong reason, and they were asking if they didn't even know they were baptized in John's baptism, and so they were rebaptized, and we were baptized for the remission of sins.
One thing that this podcast tries to do is be kind of a middle of the way between those who are preaching full-time and those who are working in ministry, and those who are on more of a scholarly pursuit with things, those who are in master's degree programs or PhD programs in biblical studies or in New Testament, Old Testament, whatever, theology, whatever. This, I think, up until now, someone might be listening and say, well, this has absolutely nothing to do with scholarly pursuits. I highly disagree. I think it has everything to do with scholarly pursuits, because when you are studying something, no matter what it is, and you go into it having an opinion, I mean, it's impossible not to go into something having an opinion or a presupposition about something. That's the way we are, so we have to go in with that. But then the ability to change your mind based on the truth that you find. That's what we all want to do, whether we are in ministry, whether we're doing scholarly stuff. I remember writing my master's thesis, which was on fasting. I started out saying, no, Christians today don't have to fast. That was a Jewish thing of the Old Testament, and it has no bearings on Christians today. And the only reason I passed defending my thesis was because Dr. Justin Rogers said, well, you started out this, and then you changed your mind. And I like someone who will change their mind faced with evidence. So that being said, just another way to kind of bring us back to where we've been, and I guess we'll end with this, and that is to ask the question, what can we learn? What lessons can we learn from being wrong? Because I think people today fear being wrong because so much rests on us being right. If we're, and it's even more so for us because both of us are in ministry. We preach, and the Bible says that those who preach and those who teach will be held to a higher standard. So, we want to make sure we get what we have right, but on a more practical level, finding out you're wrong, understanding that you're wrong, and learning your lessons from that. What are some lessons that we can learn when we find out that we're wrong?
Well, the biggest challenge with finding out you're wrong is admitting that and changing the way you do things. And once you do that, I think things are always better. But you may know you're wrong in your mind, but until you act upon that and you make those changes, and the real issue here, whether you're studying to get a master's degree or a PhD, or you're studying on your own, whatever the case may be, the real issue here is that everything we do in ministry has eternal consequences, either for us or for someone we're ministering to. And so, if we're wrong about something, then we need to put those actions into place, make those changes in our lives, and move forward. One of the things that was hard for me, I probably realized I was wrong about what I was taught about salvation a long time before I made the decision. And it was just the pride thing, and I'm a man, I don't want to walk down the aisle, I don't want to seem weak and those type of things. But we really have to do those things and make those decisions because they have eternal consequences.
So it all boils down to humility.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, Jesus even says or Paul says about Jesus, to have the mind of Jesus, to have a humble mind. And I think that's important for all of us, regardless of where we are in life, is whether or not we're in ministry, in school, or just everyday life, having a humble attitude. One last question for you. Did you ever think you'd be preaching?
When I was growing up, I youth Sundays and things, I would do that. Even though it was a denomination, I would do that. And I was fortunate to have agricultural teachers that taught me public speaking and those types of things. But to be preaching all the time, as I did at one time in my life, and to really be enthused about that, no, I really didn't. But it certainly has tremendous rewards, certainly not without sacrifices. It affects the whole family when a man decides he's going to preach. It's just something I really enjoy. But to think, did I ever think I would do it on the scale that I have done it, or on the scale that I'm doing it now? No. Maybe a talk here and there, but no, I really did.
Well, we have listeners who, some of them, like I said, are academics. A lot of them are in ministry. Leave us with one good thought, one final thought before we get out of here.
Well, here's what I would leave you, just from a practical standpoint. I think the more education one gets, the better it is, whether that's a formal education, whether that's education on your own. But the main thing is, let's not be so educated that we can't share the gospel. And it is, as we started, a people business, and we must share the gospel. We must do all we can to convert people. We must do all we can to see that as many people as we can goes to heaven. That should be our mission.
Yep, that's the goal. Well, thank you for being here, for sharing your story with us and giving us some things to think about. And I hope that you'll tune in every month to listen to Gentleman and Scholar as we continue to think about how we can be better ministers, better students, and bring the gospel to more people. And with that, we will see you next time.